Hello, everyone. I'm Shannon Shai. Welcome to another edition of Rise Beyond OCD Answers, Insight, and Inspiration to Move Forward. Today, we've got a really special guest. I call them top of the mountain type guest, foremost experts in the world on the subject that we're going to be talking about. I'll introduce our guest in a moment. I do want to read a few admin remarks. I'm so glad you're here. Whether you are living with OCD, supporting someone you love, or working in the mental health field, this is a caring space where we can learn, connect, and find hope together. And just a quick reminder, what we share today is meant for education and support. It is not a substitute for professional care. If you find yourself in crisis, please reach out. You can call or text 988 for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, or 911 if there is an immediate danger. For international support, go to findahelpline.com. Remember that you are not alone. Healing and recovery are achievable, and we are here to move forward together. Today's interview is being live streamed. The interview, like all of the other interviews in the Rise Beyond OCD series, are being recorded for later viewing on my YouTube channel and on my website, OCDRecoveryTurningPoints.com. Everyone will be muted, and your videos, it's up to you whether you have them on or off, except mine and our guest, of course. The chat room is open. I ask everyone to be respectful of others and maintain decorum. We have never, ever had a problem with that. I don't expect we'll have it today. We will have a Q&A at the end before my final question. And if you do have a question, please put it in the chat and I will try to get to them as time allots. Okay, now let me take the great honor of introducing our guest today, Dr. Randy Frost. Dr. Frost received his doctorate from the University of Kansas in 1977 and is the Harold and Elsa Cipolla Israel Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is spelled correctly on my copy. Inside joke. He has published more than 160 scientific articles and book chapters on hoarding and related topics. His work has been funded by the International OCD Foundation, IOCDF, and the National Institute of Mental Health. Dr. Frost serves on the IOCDF Scientific and Clinical Advisory Board. He has co-authored several best-selling books on hoarding, and his research has been featured on a variety of television and radio news shows, including 2020, Downtown, Good Morning America, The Today Show, Dateline, National Public Radio, General News, as well as the award-winning program, The Infinite Mind, CBS Sunday Morning, BBC News, and the Canadian broadcasting company's The Nature of Things. He has also consulted with various hoarding task forces around the world and has given hundreds of lectures and workshops on the topic in the US and internationally. And I can say that I have been in the audience for some of those at the IOCDF conferences. It is my great honor and great pleasure to introduce Dr. Randy Frost. Sir, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Shannon. And please feel free to call me Randy. That's
All
fine.
right, thank you. I considered you, along with a couple of others, but you primarily to be the world's foremost expert on this topic of hoarding. Your work just transcends like everything in this space. And I know you'll probably point to others, but I have to tell you that for me, you are at the peak of the top of the mountain. And so it is truly special to have you here today and to take time out of your Sunday to talk with us about hoarding and anything else you want to talk about. I know that there will be a big audience for this and it'll go on YouTube and it'll be passed around. So this will have an impact like everything else you do has an impact. So thank you. So if you don't mind, let's jump in. If you wanted to go ahead and say something, go ahead before we.
That's all right. Let's jump in.
Okay. You've spent decades studying hoarding. I have to ask, what first pulled you toward this work and what has kept you connected to it for all of these years?
Well, it's interesting. I fell into this accidentally. I was teaching a seminar at Smith College on OCD. And in that seminar, every year I have the students do a major term paper. Usually it's a review of research on some aspect of OCD. And one of the students asked me if she could do a paper on hoarding. And this was in 1990, so it was a long time ago. And she asked because in one of the things we read, there was a reference made to hoarding as a variant of OCD. But that was all it was, just a one-line sentence. And I asked her why she was interested in that because I knew nothing about it and no one else did either. And she said that she grew up in New York City and she remembers her mother always telling her that she had to clean up her room or she would end up like the Collier brothers. I never heard of the Collier brothers, but it turns out this is a famous case back in the 40s of two brothers who completely filled their townhouse in Manhattan with stuff all the way to the ceiling. I mean, it was a giant place, but it was every room was full. And the story goes, and this was in there was a series of stories in 1947 in the New York Times all about the Collier brothers because the police got a report that one of the brothers died. The police showed up at the home of the Collier brothers and couldn't open the front door, so they basically tore it down, but they couldn't get in the house because it was packed with newspapers stacked up against the door. So finally, they got a fire truck with a ladder and got someone up to the second floor in the ladder, and he crawled in, and he only had 2 feet of space from the top of all the stuff and the ceiling.
Oh,
And so he eventually got into the room and found one of the Collier brothers had died, and they couldn't get him out of the building without taking his body down the ladder. And then they became concerned about where the other brother was. Was he somewhere else in the house? Was he hiding? There's a whole sort of backstory to it all as well. And so this was a big deal in New York. And so when the student's mother grew up, she was living this story and sort of transferring on to her daughter. And so her daughter thought this would be an interesting thing to learn about. And I said, well, look, there is nothing in the literature on hoarding. And even people who treat OCD never see this. So, I don't think there's enough to go on to write a term paper. But if you really want to do it, let's try this. Why don't we put an ad in the newspaper and ask for someone who is a pack rat or chronic saver, considers themselves a pack rat or chronic saver, and see if we can find somebody who's willing to be interviewed. And that could be the stuff of your term paper. And so we put an ad in the local paper, and this is Northampton, Massachusetts, a town of about 37,000 people, so it's not huge. We got 100 telephone calls, and I was just blown away. And these calls were people who described their homes as being absolutely full. And so we actually visited the homes of these folks, and I was just blown away with the volume of possessions in these homes and never seen anything like it. And the sheer number of people that we ran into was really interesting, and that's really what started the ball rolling. And then once we started interviewing these folks, the thing that sort of kept it going for me was that these people are absolutely fascinating. The way in which they view the world, the thought that goes into it, the complexity of what they're dealing with is so interesting. And their lives are so interesting, tragic in many ways, but really there's something there that is meaty, that is, especially when you think about the fact that we as a society are overrun with possessions. We have many more possessions, all of us do, than our ancestors ever did. And it just keeps expanding. Our culture is dominated by possessions. So we all have this sort of relationship to the things we own. And here we have folks who have relationships that the things they own that are somehow deeper and more emotional and more connected in some way. And that just fascinated me, and that started off this whole process. And then it eventually, I think someone somewhere saw one of the first articles, 2020 Downtown called and wanted to do sort of a documentary on it. And so they had a person, and I interviewed her, went to her home, and it was a pretty well done documentary. And then it just exploded. Then lots of TV shows were wanting to do it, and so from that point on, it was a little bit felt like a runaway train.
yeah.
But it took a little bit of time because when I talked, and at the time I was working with Gail Steckety on OCD stuff, and I started talking to her about it, and she was sort of the way I was to begin with. Well, is it really OCD? It's not that serious because we don't see it very often. And so it took a little bit of convincing for me to get her interested. And then we started working together on this. And for most of the rest of the time, we worked together on this problem.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to leave out Dr. Skeksis on this because, I mean, I know that you guys have been like a team on working through this, and hoarding has evolved from what you're talking about to where it is now and what it looks like. And so that's a great segue into this next question. For anyone watching who may be new to this topic of hoarding, can you give us a hoarding 101 tutorial on hoarding and how
Yeah.
is it connected to OCD?
Yeah, yeah. When I started, one of the first things we were challenged by was coming up with some kind of a definition. And basically, we focused on three different things: the excessive levels of acquisition, the difficulty letting go of objects, and the clutter that results from it. Those three dimensions, and those have sort of held up pretty well. Now, the diagnostic code is framed just a little bit differently. So, the primary feature for the diagnosis of hoarding is the difficulty discarding or letting go of possessions. And so, there's something built in here that's kind of interesting. It's not just discarding that's the issue, it's letting go. So that includes giving things away, donating things, selling things, and so forth. It's letting go of ownership of a possession for the core feature here. The other clause in that diagnostic criteria is that regardless of the value of that object, because in the history of the DSM, there is a disorder called obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is distinct from OCD.
Right.
But one of the criteria for that personality disorder is an inability to discard worthless and worn out things. So when people hear hoarding, they have this idea that it's a problem with being able to throw out trash. But this diagnostic criteria was constructed to make it clear that that's not the case here. This is yeah, some of the things people say may look like trash to other people or may even be trash, but they also save other things that have value to an excess that interferes with their ability to live. So the primary diagnostic criteria took a long time to kind of craft to get around these issues. And the second inclusion criteria is that these things are saved due to a perceived need to save them or excessive distress over discarding them. And so that sort of rules out sort of a motivational problem where someone's home fills up with stuff and they just don't clean it up. It's not that. It's that these things mean something to them.
Right.
And that meaning is the driving force behind these symptoms. So if you notice, these two things have nothing to do with clutter. The third criteria is that these behaviors result in clutter. So clutter as a diagnostic criteria is really an outcome of the problematic behavior. So in a sense, when we're looking at in a home, that's not the real problem. That's the outcome of the problem. That's interference that's caused by the problem. Now, one could get a diagnosis if your home isn't cluttered, if what's happening is you have these first two characteristics and someone else is taking care of the clutter. Then you can still get the diagnosis. So it's not just clutter, it's clutter that you have some control over. And so those are the core features. Now, there are a couple of other features that are rule outs or exclusion criteria, like if it's due to another mental disorder, like OCD. So there is a little bit of crossover between OCD and hoarding. And you could see it sometimes. I know we've had some cases in some of our treatment studies where someone got into the study, and by the time we got to going to their home and interviewing them and looking at what we've got, we really found that it was an OCD problem. The home was full, but it was full because the person had to check the labels on every can before they could let it go. And so it wasn't that they really had a need to save this item. It was a ritual that they had abandoned because it became too overwhelming, and so they just let everything pile. So there's that overlap a little bit, and sometimes it's hard to distinguish from hoarding in that context.
Well, I can see the similarities because when I talk about OCD, a lot of the things that you just said are things that I would talk about, right? And so hoarding is its own, and I'm asking this just for clarification. I think I know the answer, but hoarding is its own disorder.
That's right. That's right. In the DSM-5, as it was coming out in 2013, there was a lot of work going on leading up to that point. Um, to make clear that OCD and hoarding are distinct. and they're distinct phenomenologically and in several other ways as well. So it's pretty clear that it doesn't really fit. It's not driven by intrusive thought the way OCD is, and so these things are quite distinct.
And when you hear the word hoarding, what do you wish people understood right away? Like, if someone came across like a relative or somebody that they really care about, and then say, hey, this person is a hoarder or is hoarding, what do you wish they understood right away about this issue?
Yeah, one of the things about hoarding and the people's understanding of hoarding is that it now is driven largely by TV shows on the topic. And those TV shows present hoarding in a very distinct way and a way that is sort of creates a stigma. And I think the important thing to keep in mind when someone has a hoarding problem or you hear of someone with a hoarding problem is to understand the fact that none of the experiences are different in nature from the experience any of us have. For instance, our cultures, when dominated by possessions, they have a magical quality to them. Things have an underlying reality that you can't observe directly, and it's that quality that really matters. And imagine the ticket stub from a favorite concert that you have. There's nothing about the physical qualities of that ticket stub that make it any different from any other ticket stub. But the meaning that that ticket stub has goes beyond its physical characteristics because that is associated with that event in your life, and you want to maintain that association. This is the basis for the souvenir industry. If you buy a basketball sneaker that once belonged to Shaquille O'Neal, what that does for you is it connects you to Shaquille O'Neal and to some sort of important person, someone you find important enough in your life to want to be connected with. It's that sort of connectionism. Now, this phenomena in psychology is called essentialism. That is, the meaning of an object goes beyond its physical characteristics. And that essentialism is what we all experience. But here in hoarding, what we have is a very exaggerated form of essentialism. It's the same phenomena, but it's just exaggerated and it applies to more objects in the person's environment. So I think that's important to understand that this is a matter of excess and not a matter of someone being somehow distinct from any of the rest of us.
It's really important. All right, let's speak directly to people who have hoarding disorder, or if they haven't been diagnosed, they might meet those three criteria. Many people watching may recognize themselves in this struggle. Can you help us understand what's going on inside someone when letting go of possessions feels emotionally unbearable, right?
Yeah, yeah. This is to answer this a complicated question because it involves a number of different things. First off, as background, we know that people with hoarding disorder experience some emotional dysregulation. And what I mean by that is three different things. First, a high level of anxiety sensitivity. So a very low threshold to experience anxiety. Secondly, an intolerance of distress. So their ability to tolerate that anxiety is low. And finally, and in part related to those two things, a tendency to engage in what's referred to in the field as experiential avoidance. That is the avoidance of any kind of negative emotional experience. Okay, so keep those three things in mind when
Mhm.
when I talk about the rest of this, and it sort of feeds into this. First of all, when I think about the inner experience, I divide up this in four different ways, and these ways have to do with the meanings these objects have for people. And that doesn't mean that these meanings are different than they are from people who don't have hoarding. It's just that they're exaggerated for people with hoarding. And the first is issues related to opportunity and identity. And so the attachment to the object has to do with the opportunity that that object presents and the sense of my identity that's wrapped up in that object. Now, there are a couple of things to keep in mind here. First, this notion of opportunity. I've often thought that maybe hoarding is a disorder, a disordered sense of opportunity. So, for most of us, as we go through life, we get presented with a multitude of opportunities, one sort or another. And to take advantage of one, we have to let others go. But what if we couldn't tolerate letting go of all those other opportunities? What kind of how would we be stuck? I've got a quote from one of my early clients, and this is in the book stuff. Her name, she went by Irene in the book, and this is one of the things she told me about her experience. She said, "Life is a river of opportunities. If I don't grab everything interesting, I'll lose out. Things will pass me by. The stuff I have is like a river. It flows into my house, and I try to keep it from flowing out. I want to stop it long enough to take advantage of it." So her house was filled with these things that each represented an opportunity, but she never had time to take advantage of any of them. So they just built up in her house because she couldn't stand to let them go. Now, the other part of this is this sort of identity-based thing, and all of this opportunity and identity-based attachments. The saving behavior is motivated by a fear of loss of that opportunity, loss of identity. And the first part of identity is a potential identity that a person can have. So Irene, the woman I just talked about, had 300 cookbooks. She had many newspapers filled with recipes. She saved every recipe in every magazine she had, but she never cooked. The recipes and the cookbooks were designed for her future. This is who she was going to be. And it wasn't the use of these possessions that was rewarding to her. It was the dream they allowed her to dream, the future identity. 'Cause this is who she was going to be. She was going to be a great cook. She was going to make dinner parties for all of her friends and so forth. But she never got to that point. She got the collecting done, but that's all. So this idea is that she is losing this potential identity if she gets rid of these things. And that's what it feels like to her. I'm never going to be that person if I get rid of this. And so that's a part of it. The other part is losing the idealized past. That is my personal history. So Irene, for instance, one day when I was working with her, she pulled out an old ATM envelope. ATM machines used to spit out cash in an envelope, and she'd kept the envelope. It was empty, but she'd written on the back of it what she spent it on. Grocery store items, drugstore items, nothing unusual. And she put it in the recycling box, and she started to cry. And what she said was, it feels like I'm losing this day in my life. And if I lose too much, there'll be nothing left of me. So this was a sort of a marker, a tag that kept her identity close to her. And if she got rid of it, who would she be? She would lose that identity. So this first cluster of meanings has to do with opportunity identity. The second cluster has to do with safety and comfort. I can't tell you how many people with hoarding disorder describe their homes as cocoons or bunkers against the world. And how many people feel like the world is dangerous. And if they get rid of something, a common phrase is, it feels like I'm going to die. This idea that I'm not safe without these things. Now, for all of us, the things we have, the things in our home are signals of safety for us. We come home and relax and we feel comfortable and so forth. But for people with hoarding, many feel vulnerable, and so these items are sort of sacred to them in terms of comfort. And if anyone touches them even or moves them, they feel violated. And that's why so many family members have gotten into big trouble with their hoarding loved one if they move or if they try to do anything to take care of this problem, because it feels to them like they're being violated, physically violated. Now, we do know that this fear of physical violation is linked to trauma, and there is a higher trauma history in people with hoarding disorder than even for people with OCD. So that is part of the issue. Now,
That's interesting.
one of the interesting things I've found in the history of this is that there was a Spanish psychiatrist back in the 60s who suggested a disorder called what he called soteric neurosis, after Sotera, the god of safety or goddess of safety. And what he said was, this problem is just a mirror image of a phobia. So a phobia is where there is a fear of an object of some kind, an unreasonable fear of an object. And what he said was that, okay, in this disorder, there is an unreasonable belief in the protective value of this object. And so that unreasonable belief is just a mirror image of a phobia. Instead of being afraid of it, you'd be overly attached to it because you feel like it's going to protect you somehow, which is a fascinating piece of history. But that idea went nowhere because nobody ever picked up on it. But it is pretty interesting. So that's the second of these four. I hope I'm not going on too long.
Oh, you're good. You're good. You're making a very complex question understandable. So I appreciate it.
So the third of these is what I call a responsibility-based attachment. Here, the notion is that ownership carries with it a responsibility not to waste or harm a possession. And so the saving behavior is, in this case, instead of being motivated by loss or motivated by distress, as the other two, this is motivated by guilt. And so people with this problem, and this is one of the fascinating things about it, people have the ability to make associations with these objects that are far more complex than the rest of us. And they can see a use for any object. And once they see the use for that object, they can't let it go. So Irene, for instance, in that space around her refrigerator, where there's a space between the edge of the refrigerator and the cupboard sometime. Hers was packed full of the cardboard tubes from toilet paper rolls. And what she said was, these I'm saving for my son's art teacher because they make great art supplies. You could do all kinds of artworks with them. Now, she'd never met her son's art teacher. She had no idea that he would want these things, but she's had that thought one day, that association with these things. And because of that, to throw them away, she would feel guilty, like she was wasting them.
Yeah.
Now, fear of waste is the primary issue here with responsibility. And in fact, it turns out in some of our research, it looks like that's maybe the strongest driving force for hoarding behavior is this fear of waste, the strongest predictor of difficulty discarding. And it might explain some of the most unusual symptoms we see in hoarding. One of the most unusual symptoms we see is the saving and consuming of food that is rotten and out of date. And so some people, even food that a therapist can see is rotting, they insist that they have to save it. They don't want to waste it. And so that fits in with this sense of responsibility. Now here, the responsibility sense is so strong that I find it similar to scrupulosity in OCD. In fact, we did one paper and named it material scrupulosity, a set of rigid beliefs that include an exaggerated sense of duty or moral or ethical responsibility for the care and disposition of a possession to prevent it from being wasted or harmed. And that it's so strong in these folks, it makes their behavior look very unreasonable. On a sort of a more nominal level, what we see in people with hoarding disorder and where that plays out is in treatment where people say, well, I can get rid of this. I just have to find a good home for it. So again, that responsibility is carrying over to when they're releasing it because they can't release it unless they find a responsible home for it. Another piece of this is a little bit of perfectionism where I have to get rid of this the correct way. So some people have to bind their junk mail just right before they get rid of it. Another way this plays out is that things have to be maximally used. This sense of frugality is quite strong. We have one of our cases where the fellow had a rusty bucket with a hole in it, and we had other buckets, but he didn't want to get rid of this one because, well, he could carry other things in it. Just no liquid. We had someone else who couldn't throw away a paper towel after she used it to dry her hands because, after all, it wasn't really dirty. It was just wet, and so she would hang them out to dry and so forth. So this
Right.
of frugality. So that fear of waste is a major part of it, but also there's a fear of harming objects. And here it comes into play. Another feature we see of people with hoarding disorder who have a tendency to anthropomorphize their objects, that is to give their objects human-like qualities.
Mm.
So one of our cases in the book is a woman who pretty much had control of her hoarding symptoms, and I asked her if she wouldn't mind if I described her as someone who had gotten over the problem, gotten in control of the problem. She said, I don't think so because, and then she went on to explain how she had this experience the other day where she was trying to throw away a used yogurt container. She'd consumed the yogurt and even rinsed it out, but it was a used container, and she was trying to decide how to get rid of it because she didn't want to throw it in the recycling because it would suffer with all the other things in that recycling bin traveling to its ultimate destruction, and especially if she left the cap on, it would be humid inside, and it would be really uncomfortable and so forth. So and then she'd stop in the middle of the explanation and said, "And, I know this is crazy thinking. I know this just doesn't make sense, but this is how I feel." And so that sense of not wanting this object to be harmed. So that's the sort of responsibility-based attachments. Then finally is the aesthetic sensitivity attachment. That is this what I refer to as an awe-based attachment. There's a visual sensitivity. Irene, for instance, one day when I showed up, her eyes lit up and she said, "I have to show you something." She ran into the next room and brought out this large clear plastic bag filled with bottle caps. And she said, "Look at these bottle caps. Aren't they beautiful? The shape and the color and the texture." And I knew that I'm not a terribly artistic person, but, what my view of a bottle cap without a bottle, I only have this simple thought, and that's trash. But for
Right.
her, the thoughts are florid, the thoughts are the associations, the appreciation of the awe of this color, of this visual sensation of these things. And so in some ways, especially with the responsibility and aesthetic sensitivity, I think there's a case to be made that people who experience hoarding have a kind of giftedness. And that giftedness is to be able to appreciate the aesthetic value of possessions and the responsibility associated with having those possessions. And the problem with the aesthetic sensitivity business is the same problem we see with other parts of this, is that aesthetic sensitivity doesn't translate into producing an object of that would be considered art or creative. It's just because it overwhelms them. But this sense in which this is, on the one hand, a gift, but it's a gift that is also a curse because it leads them to be unable to live a, a life in their home environment that is unfettered, that is not constrained by all the things around them. Um, so all of this stuff goes together to kind of describe what it's like for people to try to get rid of things, and that's what we as therapists and people with hoarding have to understand. I think when they try to address it, and not only that, but it sort of speaks to how these other things like anxiety sensitivity and the stress tolerance fit in. Because what happens is that once an object enters someone's home, there's so many objects that object never gets looked at again. That there's never any time spent considering how important that object is. And if they pick it up and look at it and they start thinking about throwing it away, their anxiety goes up. They don't tolerate that well. And the easiest thing for them to do is put it back on the shelf or put it back on the pile in the middle of the floor. A good example, Irene was an art history major, and this was 35 years earlier. She had all these art history books, and we were going through them. She was trying to decide what to sell and what to keep. She picked up one of the books, put it in a cell pile, and started to cry. And she said, "It feels like I'm going to die."
Mm.
And so she talked a bit more about it, but she left it in the cell box and we went on to something else. A few minutes later, I asked her how she felt. It felt a little better. And as time went by, a little better, especially, and this is sort of a tangent, especially if the book was no longer in sight. So that visual cueing was something. But if I hadn't been there and she'd experienced that, how many of us, if they feel like they're going to die, how many of us would say, I'm not going to feel this way. I'm going to put this back over here so I don't have to feel it again. And that's sort of the experience that I know that's a long, a
No,
long,
no, it's great because, well, one, people need to understand it. And I could go back and try to comment on almost everything you said. And I can again draw parallels to the just pure, not puro, but OCD. If you're just
yeah,
talking about OCD, a lot of parallels. Maybe most prominently is even the person who's experiencing can look at it and say, that's just irrational, unreasonable. I know that it's not, but you have no idea that it feels how real all of this feels to me,
yes, yes,
how real it feels. And people who don't have the disorder, whether we're talking hoarding or OCD, it's difficult to try to understand because objectively you can look at it and say, why are you worried about that? Why are you keeping that? Why are you, that doesn't make any sense. And they can't understand because they don't know how real all of this feels and that fear. And the next topic we're going to talk about is shame, right? I know in the OCD world, there's a lot of shame that goes around, whether it's because of the thoughts themselves or because of the behavior that we're exhibiting. And
Mhm.
people are looking at you going, why are you doing that? I can only imagine. And well, I'm not guessing because I know people who have hoarding disorder and they tell me that they feel ashamed.
Yeah.
Again, we're talking to people who have hoarding disorder. How does shame shape the disorder, and why is it so important that we talk about it openly?
Yeah, yeah. I think that shame is probably one of the reasons why, all the way back in 1990, nobody knew anything about hoarding, because most people who suffer from hoarding problems hide their home from other people. They don't let other people in. And when they do, other people response that other people give to them makes them even less likely to have anybody come over. And I think what happened before we started sort of opening the door to this is people just hid and didn't say anything about it. And we at one point thought, and well, let's look at other people coming into the clinic. I worked a lot with Dave Tolan at Hartford Hospital, and so we did this study where we looked at the anxiety disorder patients coming into the clinic and asked them about hoarding. And we found a remarkable, almost a third of them had some level of hoarding. And they were already coming in for mental health treatment, and they would talk about anxiety and the things that bother them, but they wouldn't talk about hoarding. And I think that shame has been there for a long time. And I know people who grow up in a hoarded home describe what they call doorbell dread. If someone comes to the door and rings the doorbell, there's a great shuffle to try to hide whatever is behind the curtain here. So that shame is real, and it's pretty powerful. And I think it's even gotten a bit worse, especially with the TV shows on hoarding that have made it stigmatized it a bit. But I think once you get through that, and once people understand the nature of this, because I've had lots of people, especially early on, once I talked to them about it, they said, I never knew what this was called. I didn't know it was anything. I just thought it was just me, that there was something just different about me than anyone else in the world. And that sort of thing adds to it. But the more information gets out about it, and the more people talk about it, and especially if they talk about it in a way that does not demean people. And I think that's getting better.
That's why we're doing what we're doing today. And I want everybody to be informed about this. I want people to know that you can talk about this. You can go be seen by somebody who can help you. And it's not you, right? There's nothing to feel ashamed about, right? I understand you feel shame, but let's work on this. Let's do something to help you, right? Gain freedom. I could go on, and I won't. So if someone watching this video is feeling overwhelmed, embarrassed, or stuck, what would you want them to know about themselves and their situation if we're talking hoarding?
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens is people's homes are so full, they feel there's no hope. They're just overwhelmed. And I think focusing on the state of the home at that early point is maybe something that you can put off for a bit, and to focus instead on learning how to stop avoiding the processing of the importance of a possession. Because what happens is when people see something, this impression, this myriad of wonderful thoughts about how I could use this possession and so forth, a cloud judgment. And once it comes into the home, then it's never considered again. But considering it in the context of your life, and knowing that if you get rid of this thing, you're going to experience distress. It's important to understand that that's part of the process of getting better. Being able to let go of something, experiencing the distress associated with that, and coming back and saying, it's okay now, later. But that distress is the only way we're going to get people to process the true importance of that object. They have to test out whether or not that object is truly important in their life, because their thoughts about it are in some ways their heart, I guess you could say, their attachment to it is clouding their judgment, and that they don't understand the true importance that that thing has. And the only way they can understand the true importance of something is to get rid of it. And then once you get rid of it, then you can see how little impact that's had on your life or will have on your life. That is in any way positive.
Yeah, I want to skip over a couple of questions that I had sent you because I want to, what you're talking is a perfect platform to dive off into this. Let's talk about some treatment and recovery. Can you walk
Right.
us through what effective evidence based treatment for hoarding actually looks like today?
Yeah, there are a couple of pieces to it, and it goes down to this original triad of things: the acquisition piece, the difficulty discarding, and the clutter. And so the acquisition, unfortunately, we didn't get to that and talking about the diagnosis, but acquisition, excessive acquisition of objects, is not included as a diagnostic criteria, but it is included as a diagnostic specifier. So once the diagnosis of hoarding is made, then you specify whether or not it's accompanied by excessive acquisition. Now, in some ways, I think that might be a mistake because we know that 95% of people with hoarding have excessive levels of acquisition. So the same phenomena happens if they're out somewhere and they see something. And here, understanding this process is important for constructing a treatment. So what happens in an acquisition episode is someone sees something they want to acquire. They purchase it or get it for free or whatever. And what happens is their focus of attention narrows so that the only thoughts they're having are about how important this object is, what it would be like, my future would be like with this object, and so forth and so on. And what's not accessible to them is the context of their life, whether they have room for this thing, whether they have money to afford it, whether they already have something like it. None of those questions are being asked at the time of acquisition because their focus is so narrow and how wonderful this could be. So knowing that, it gives us an avenue. So one of the things we do early on in treatment is we sit people down, we have a discussion about what's important to them, what they think they should ask themselves if they're going to acquire something. And by and large, people come up with the same set of questions. Do I have money for it? Do I really need it? Is it interesting enough? And so forth and so on. And we have them write out those questions. And in our book, Buried in Treasures, we have a cardboard cutout where you write those questions out. And then you take those questions with you wherever you go. If you want to acquire something, you pull them out and you answer those questions. Then what that does, it brings the context of your life into the decision-making process in a way that wasn't there before. So a simple procedure. And it seems to be pretty good at slowing down this.
Yeah.
The second thing we do with acquisition is and all of this is tied into early discussions in therapy about values. What is it that you value most in life? And how do you want your behavior to be structured to move toward those values? And that's a critical piece of the treatment here because it's those values that are going to affect the motivation for what needs to happen. And so a part of this discussion about acquiring is related to that. But on top of that, we do a process where we try to train the person to tolerate the urge to acquire. And we do that by we call non-shopping trips. So we have people create a hierarchy, just the way we would with a hierarchy for exposure, of situations where there are stronger and stronger urges to acquire things. And then we have them work their way up that hierarchy, going out, looking at shopping, and walking away without buying something. And we have people keeping track of the way they feel. So because we used to do this, or we still do it actually, at the International OCD Foundation every year. We have non-shopping trips for people with hoarding disorder. And one of the first ones we did, we kept track. We had people keep track of not only their urge to buy something, but their level of distress associated with not buying. And we had people go out in the shopping center, pick out something they really liked, described it, and we had a therapist going with each person, describe it to the therapist, and then walk away. And as soon as they walked away, they gave a rating of their urge and distress. As soon as they got to the edge of the store, as soon as they got back to the conference, and so forth. And what happened in each case is that the urge and distress came down. And I can remember one particular case that Gail was a therapist for. This woman had found a cookbook and found a recipe in the cookbook that she really liked, and she really just wanted this. And so her urge was through the roof. And talking to Gail, said, "Look, I will." This woman said, "I'll leave and I'll go all the way back to Conference Hotel, but I'm telling you now, I'm coming back and buying this later." And so they walked to the front of the store. She gave her urgent distress rating. He got back to the conference, the urgent distress rating. And she looked at her urgent distress graph. She was amazed. She said, when I was there, I thought I would never be able to tolerate not having that. And I don't really, in truth, she said, I can't even remember what that recipe was for. Time, giving it time is what taught her that this urge that's so powerful is something that she can control. So that's the other part of the treatment for acquisition. And that's a little bit different than the treatment for difficulty discarding, where although some of the features are the same, what I like to call this what we're doing here is processing a possession. And what that means is sitting down and picking up a possession and telling its story. And I think the most effective way of doing that is if you have someone to tell the story to. One of the cases I've been working with is a woman who lives in LA. I live in Massachusetts. And she came to the conference one year and she sat in my workshop and I had a student doing a role play with me. And she came up and said, "Look, why bother having an actress do this? Why don't I do it? And I'll try to throw things away and I'll tape myself. And I'm going to describe what it's like. And you can use that in your workshops," which I do now. And since that time, she's sent me over 200 of these things. Each
Yeah.
amazing. She throws something away, and then I have her come back 10 minutes later, 30 minutes later, and so forth. And she's amazed at how this has happened. And now her home is almost completely clear. Now she has second
Wow.
position sometimes, but in terms of getting rid of things, there's some features of it that are really critical. I think telling the story of possession, going through its history, and that helps them to define the true meaning that the possession has. And in truth, that's something that they seldom do. Once it's acquired and all that initial glow of having it is gone, then they never really sit down and say, "Well, what does this mean?" So that telling the story does that. Second is communicating it to someone. To know that someone else cares and is listening and not trying to get them to throw something away, but just listening to understand what the process is they're going through. And then reiterating what I learned by this. I threw this away. 30 minutes later, I'm fine with it. What does that mean to me? So I think that's the process that has to happen in order for someone to change the nature of their attachment to possessions. And that's really the key to treating the difficulty discarding
Go ahead. Go ahead. No, no, keep going.
part. This third part of the triad is a little bit different because that clutter will start clearing up once the attachment has changed. Now, in some cases, you may have to do separate clutter work if it's so extreme that it's dangerous. But that clutter work, we have to understand that just getting rid of the clutter is not going to change the problem. Behavior's still there. So it's this attachment that has to change for long-term gain. The clutter can be done in sometimes in a shorter term, but there are dangers with doing that because you don't want to force people to throw things away, and yet people if people can't throw it away and it's unsafe, it puts everyone in a bind at that point. Because what do you do with an unsafe home?
Yeah. And I think, well, again, perfect segue because my next question is about just thinking that the answer to this is clean it up, throw it out, let's get rid of everything. How can that backfire? You started with that doesn't address the actual problem, right? But how can it backfire? If you were just going to walk in, I have a loved one. Sorry, I know you want to answer this, but I'm setting it up. I have a loved one, and I think it's unsafe where they're living, how they're living. It's unsafe. They're not doing anything about it. So I'm going to go in and help them get rid of this stuff.
Right.
Why is that not such a great idea?
Well, for one thing, two things really. First of all, it violates trust, and so now this person is not going to allow you in their home anymore, and that's what typically happens. That the relationship fractures, and sometimes the whole family fractures happens. And secondly, it develops a resistance to any kind of help from anyone because the assumption is, for many people with this problem, the assumption is that therapist comes in here, they're going to make me throw things out, and I don't want to. And that's not the right place to be in. And the problem, especially with early on in the history of hoarding, when people tried to intervene, therapists tried to intervene. What happened is you'd have a session where the person would pick up something and start talking about it, and the therapist would make the arguments for why this person should throw it away. And the person, what are they going to do? Well, they make the arguments for why they should keep it. That's the way this thing works. It's all based on, if you know anything about motivational interviewing, this idea of ambivalence about change. And people with disorders, hoarding like other disorders, are ambivalent. There are reasons why they want to hang on to these symptoms because it protects them from
Right.
something. And so that ambivalence is really hard. And what we have to do as a therapist is to get them to explore the ambivalence, and we have to have them make the argument for why they should throw it away, and us to challenge them on that, to get them thinking in that way. A great example in our early studies, we had a different therapist working with living clients. I supervised them, and one gentleman came, the therapist, a great therapist, great OCD therapist. He had a young woman who was had a hoarding problem. The whole session I'm listening to, they're talking about, um, I forget what it was they were going to throw away, and he's arguing, or why this would be a good idea to let go of it, and she's arguing why it wasn't a good idea, and so forth. And I said, look, next time, why don't you try something? Why don't, when she picks up something and starts talking about it, why don't you argue that she should keep it and see what happens? So the next time they're in session and she pulls up a dress out of her closet and she said, "This dress belonged to my grandmother. And my grandmother's been dead for 10 years. She was a very special person for me. That's why I've kept it. But what should I do?" And he said, "Well, look, she's a very special person. Maybe that'd be something for you to hang on to." And what did she say? She said, "Well, yeah, but I have all this other stuff with my grandmother, so I'm not sure I really need." So this ambivalence was now playing out between, but they were on different sides now. And she was on the side we want her to be on to make
Right.
her up for getting rid of it. So a part of this whole therapy process is using that kind of motivational interviewing to get to the point of having people process and make decisions that will change the nature of their attachments to possessions, because that's really the key.
Yeah. And we're going to come back to the therapist, but let's address now family members, right? Family members who we talked a little bit about don't really understand the fear that this person feels, and they just look at it and say, "That's not that's irrational what you're doing." And they obviously love and care for the person. They don't want them to be living like this, however you wanted to say it.
Yeah.
So, two parts to this. One is, what do you suggest that family members do? How do they approach it? And is there anything that you would change about what you say in that, if we're really talking about an actual safety issue, right?
Yeah, if there is an imminent safety threat, then the rules are a little bit different because there may be some emergency things that have to happen. Most cases, the safety is more of a long-term safety issue, so it's not as much of an emergency. Family members are in a tough spot. There are two really waves of family where they're in a tough spot. First is a child who's raised in an environment like this many times will come away with the feeling that my parent loves their things more than they love me. And that's a devastating thing for a child to live with and to grow up with, and creates a great deal of resentment later in life. The second kind of thing that fractures the family is an adult child of someone with a hoarding problem where they are worried about their family member's safety and they are frustrated by their attempts to do something, and will often take the matter into their own hands and do something. And then the family fractures. And then the hoarding loved one refuses to let people come into the home. And then the family member ends up rejecting them, saying, "I give up. It's out of my hands. I'm just not going to intervene at all." And both of those are really devastating for not just for the person with the hoarding problem, but for the family member. And what I can say a couple things. First, it's so hard for family members to go into the home and not try to do something to make it better. But in truth, one of the things we know about hoarding is that if people stop visiting in that person's home, the situation gets worse. If someone is coming over to the home to visit, they will spend time on their things trying to straighten them up. And even in the case we have, the worst of the worst, where we say we're going to come out and do an evaluation, they know we want to look at the home at its worst. We get there and they say, well, I've spent the last hour and a half cleaning up. So that having someone visit is important. So if you stop visiting, then the situation is going to get worse. Now, the second thing is if you visit and you try to do something to convince them to throw something away and you meet resistance, that is going to backfire and it's going to leave them wanting you to leave, and they're not going to respond in the way you want. But if you ask them, just tell me about this possession. So what if I go in and ask people, let me know, why is this important to you? And just listen and let them expand. This is how it started with this woman, Marnie, who's sending me these.
Yeah.
She's just explaining. And this one didn't start out to be a therapeutic exercise. She was just explaining to me what it was like if she tried to throw this out. And the more she did it, the more she said, well, I think I can do it. And so just being a receptive ear to what they are experiencing, just trying to understand. I think maybe that's the key, trying to understand what it's like for them to work their way through this is something that might go a long way to at least getting them to consider seeking help for this.
Yeah, and we can certainly agree that judging them, criticizing them, belittling them, none of that works, right? You're
No.
not going to get them to get rid of anything by doing those things, right?
Not by shaming, not by coercion, not by even presenting arguments for why you should get rid of it isn't it is not gonna produce that kind of behavior. They're gonna have to come up with the decision to let it go and the decision to try to do this. It sort of goes back to the bridge phenomena you were talking to me about, this decision to work on it. They need to decide they're gonna work on it because working on it, the hard truth is it's going to be difficult and you're going to experience distress. You're going to feel anxious. You're going to be fearful. You're going to feel unsafe. You're going to feel guilt, all of those things. But those emotions that are connected with these things are sham in a way because they're not truly tied to anything all that important.
Yeah. And you mentioned Marnie's name. So for anyone watching, you can go to Marnie's YouTube channel, just type Marnie Hoarding and it'll pop up and you'll get an example. She does a really great job. I mean, I've watched a few of them, and she also presented at the IOCDF conference last year, which is when I saw her, and she talked about you. She adores you. So, but yeah, her videos are very effective, and I think it's a good example of doing exactly what you're talking about, telling that story.
Yeah.
Um, all right. In the interest of time, I mean, I could talk to you probably for 8 hours. I know you don't have 8 hours, but I'm learning so much just asking you these questions. Let's jump quickly to therapists who are treating hoarding disorder. And one of my purposes in doing this series and with you and the other Dream Team members is I want new therapists in this space to learn from the icons, right? People who've done this for decades and know so much and have written the books about how to do this. We'll come back to your book in a minute. What is the most important mindset to bring into the room with hoarding clients? If you were talking to a new therapist and you just said, look, this is like the most important thing that I want you to keep in mind when you walk into the room with a hoarding client, what would you say?
I would say that the most important approach or the most important function of a therapist in this context is curiosity. You want to learn what their experience is like. And by learning what their experience is like and going through the process of telling the story of these possessions, you're going to learn what this person's all about. And that curiosity will be communicated to them. And that's important for the relationship because they need to have someone hear about this object, why they kept it, and basically be a sounding board for their rationale, their arguments with themselves about whether to keep it or whether to throw it away. I know, especially early on in the history of trying to teach people how to treat hoarding. Many therapists wouldn't treat hoarding cases because they're so difficult and are described as so frustrating because I think, as helpers, we have this orientation to try to help the person in as simple and as quick a way as possible. And you look at the state of someone's home and you think to yourself, unless you know really more about hoarding, you think to yourself, okay, this room's a mess, but I think in a couple of hours we can really get it looking decent. And so let's do that. We're going to do this quickly. So the person and so the easiest thing to say when someone picks something up is say, "Oh, just throw it out. Just throw it out." And that it's a simple instruction meant to be helpful, but in this context, it backfires. And if you come into a therapy situation with the idea that this is going to be a quick thing just because it seems so easy to the rest of us to be able
Right.
to that's going to backfire. And so you have to be patient and curious. And those are two things I think that are imperative. And to know enough about motivational interviewing to be able to talk to people about this without putting them off, without making them feel that you are pressuring them. And those are key.
Yeah, and that raises the next question, trust. And maybe, I mean, maybe the answer is be patient and learn about motivational interviewing. But would you add anything else to that about the importance of building trust with your client and how to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And the first rule in treating these folks is never touch anything without permission, because even the touching of it can change it. And part, I think, people with hoarding disorder organize their world in different ways. Most of us organize our world categorically. So we put, electricity bill with the other utility bills in a file, and we want to find one particular bill. We go to that general category, that file, and we find that bill. And so that's how we keep our world organized. But for people with hoarding disorder, for the most part, they tend to organize their world visually and spatially. So they've got a pile of things in the middle of the room. And if you ask them where the electricity bill is, they'll say, well, I think it's on the left and about a foot down. So their world is organized as a three-dimensional picture, a map. And if someone comes in and moves anything, they've changed the map. And it's like someone coming in and dumping out your file cabinet. And so for them, then it feels like, even if you move just one thing, it feels like everything's distorted. Now I don't know where anything is. And that creates this distrust. It's important to make sure that before you touch anything or move anything, you get permission. And the other thing is you have to make sure that you are not going to tell them what to throw out. The decisions are theirs. The decisions have to be theirs because they have to learn how to make these decisions. We can't make the decisions for them. They have to learn how to make these decisions. And so the decision is up to them. If they want to save something, that's fine. They want to keep something, that's their prerogative.
Which is the most powerful way to get better is when you take the responsibility. I do this OCD and it sounds like for hoarding too, when the individual takes responsibility for making the decision that they're going to do this, like in the OCD context, I'm not going to perform this compulsion. No matter how much anxiety I have, I'm making the decision. I'm taking this what feels like real risk. That's what really
That's what builds the
it
trust.
delivers the blow, right, to the disorder. So I guess sounds like the same thing with hoarding.
And it doesn't mean that the person won't have an emotional and maybe a negative emotional response to you. For instance, Marnie, in one of the videos she sent me, she described how she was throwing out a blanket and how difficult it was and how horrible she felt and how angry and mad. And then she stopped in the video and said, and I kind of hate you, but I didn't ask her to throw it out. She had made the decision. So sometimes it kind of spills over and you have to have enough trust already built up that doesn't explode because she trusts me, but yet sometimes she feels that heavy emotion.
Yeah. And as a therapist, you have to be able to like withstand, right? Take that and say, okay, this is part of the job, part of the process. I can handle that, right? But it's more important to have her or him go through this process, right? All right. So let me do this out of respect for your time. I have one question here to ask
Mhm.
from the audience, and then I have a final question for you. But before I do either of those, where can people find your work? If they want to know the best way to find all the stuff that Dr. Randy Frost has done on hoarding, what would you tell them? Where would you point your finger?
Well, I have a couple of books out. One is Stuff, Compulsive Hoarding and Meaning of Things, which is a book for the general public, but also for people with hoarding problems and their family members. It's not a how-to book. It's a description of the phenomena. And I think people will find it interesting because it's sort of takes this curiosity kind of viewpoint. So another book that we have a couple of different editions of is Buried in Treasures. And Buried
Yeah.
in Treasures is something that we have worked into a workshop format. So there's a little story behind it. I was consulting with the local hoarding task force in Massachusetts, and they asked me to if I would put together a support group for people with hoarding. And I demurred. I said, I don't think a support group is really going to do anything, but I think maybe an action-oriented group might work. So I'll do that. So I used a student. A student was the first person who actually facilitated the group. We put together a little facilitator manual about how to do it, and we worked through the Buried in Treasures book chapter by chapter. And initially, the student was one who wanted to do this as an own project, and I thought, well, a support group. I don't think a support group's going to give enough, or action group is really going to give enough to really make a big difference, but we'll try it anyway. We did, and lo and behold, we got great results. And so then, okay, we'll repeat it to make sure because the first time we only used self-reporting instruments. The second time we said, okay, well, let's do a full-fledged assessment. We'll go to the home and do a observation. We did it, and lo and behold, it was great results. And so we then did a waitlist control group. And then we found that this was virtually the same kind of effects we're getting with cognitive behavior therapy with a therapist. And the second group, we had it run by a peer. And so our idea is to create these peer-led workshops
Oh,
to work through the book. And it now there are buried in treasures groups going on all over the world. Australia has a bunch of them going on, and
that's awesome.
so it's been a great experience. So Burying Treasures is another one of the books. A more recent book is one published by the American Psychiatric Association on hoarding disorder, comprehensive clinical guide to hoarding disorder, and it covers more the research-based stuff on hoarding disorder that we know about. So I did that one with Karen Rodriguez at Stanford.
Okay, to our question, our audience here, a question that comes from our friend Matthew in England. What is a reasonable, sustainable pace for decluttering that won't cause a relapse into more severe hoarding?
Good question, Matthew. I think it's probably pretty individual. I think early on, the pace is going to be slow, especially working item by item. But as time goes by, the pace can pick up. And so you can get through more and more things. And it might be an interesting experiment to run. Again, in doing this kind of treatment, we rely on experiments a lot to see what would happen if. So, what would happen if I throw something away that I have a anxiety level of 10 about letting go, or a 10 out of 10? What would happen? And the higher you're able to go in that experimental process, the quicker that pace is going to be.
All right. So let me ask you a final question. And I have three to choose from, and I don't know which one I want to ask you, but I'm going to just choose one. I'm going to make a decision here and just choose one. I'll go a little bit more broad and kind of focus in the world of hope. When you think about recovery from hoarding disorder, not
Mm.
perfection, right? None of us can achieve that. What does a hopeful, meaningful life look like for someone with hoarding disorder?
I think a hopeful life is one where they can engage in the normal activities of daily living without being hampered in a significant way, and a life where they don't spend an inordinate amount of time managing possessions, because that's unfortunately what happens with people with hoarding disorder. They spend a lot of time trying to work through it without really making any progress, and that prevents them from the other aspects of life that are more important. So those are the two features. Now, the amount of clutter and the amount of possessions, it doesn't really matter how much stuff anyone owns, as long as that stuff doesn't get in the way of your living a comfortable life.
Yeah. Well, you're an amazing man. Thank you from everybody who's ever suffered from anything for dedicating your life to helping people. There was a comment came from Jamie here that said, "It's amazing how you care for folks. Well done." Right. And so I echo that. You're just an amazing individual. You've always been, when I've observed you, like at the IOCDF conference, and even over the years, like when I was board president, we've had a few conversations. You've always been so kind. You're such a kind person and easy to talk to. And for people who suffer, who come to you, and I've just observed this, you're so gracious and giving of your time, and everybody's important. So it really is awesome, like, one, to be associated with you. I'm very honored that you chose to come on and do this as part of this series that I call the Icons, or the Dream Team of Recovery. So thank you so much. I really, really do appreciate you coming on.
Oh, well, thank you, Shannon. That's very nice of you to say that. Appreciate it.
All right. With that, everybody, have a great rest of your Sunday. I really appreciate your time, sir, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Thank you. You too, Shannon.
All right, see you later. Bye bye.